Hey folks, so this is Caleb, and I wanted to do this video because I wanted to ask the question, why is it that the USA and the leaders of the USA don't seem to like Russia or China? What's that really about? Now, some people will say, well, it's about human rights, right? These governments, the Russian government, the Chinese government, don't respect human rights the same way that U.S. leaders do. We have, just a different perspective. We feel like the people of Russia, the people of China are being oppressed. But that's a pretty flawed answer to the question, because if you look all over the world, there are governments that violate human rights very, very openly and are on very friendly terms with the U.S. government. Take Saudi Arabia, for example. It's a country that still cuts off people's heads in public. Most of the country are guest worker slaves with no human rights. You can go down the line. Saudi Arabia, is an absolute monarchy, no even notion of democracy or human rights, so we can just throw that one out there. It's not about human rights. And then some people will say, well, we just have a different culture. Those people in Russia, those people in China, they think differently than we do. We have our way, they have theirs. We're a big country, they're a big country, we just don't get along. I don't think that's correct either. But if you look at what's going on now, with the fact that we just put a huge economic tariff onto China, China's responding. You look at the fact that these diplomats were just expelled from the United States. There's this whole history, but what is it about Russia and China that Western leaders don't like? Well, you need to look at the history of the 20th century. When the 20th century began, Russia and China were both very, very, very poor countries. They were just deeply, deeply poor. They used to call China the sick man of Asia. Huge amounts of poverty, huge amounts of drug addiction. Russia was an agrarian country with very little industry, very little manufacturing. Mostly just an agrarian country, and it was, it had control over Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan was selling oil to the rest of the world. It was where, these big oil fields that were controlled by the Rothschilds and British bankers and the Dutch, so that was Russia and China at the beginning of the 20th century. However, both countries had earth-shaking revolutions in which, there was an upsurge in which a government came to power that took control of the economies and essentially turned the countries into superpowers. Russia, you had the revolution in 1917, but ultimately it didn't start becoming a superpower until 1928, when Stalin launched his 5-year plans. And all of a sudden, Russia, which had no steel industry before, was suddenly producing huge amounts of steel. Eventually got to the point they were producing more steel than any other country in the world, more tractors than any other country in the world. They were, it was just this huge, huge leap, and pretty soon they were defeating the Nazis, and they were in outer space. They were the first country to conquer outer space, and, the Soviet Union just became this world superpower. And then you had World War II, and they were even stronger, rebuilding the country, modern housing, modern electricity. You had a very impoverished agrarian, semi-feudal country turn into a world superpower. China, 1949. You have a revolution, the Communist Party comes to power. They start building steel mills, they start building highways, they start building railway, they start, constructing modern universities, wiping out illiteracy. They have a falling out with Russia, but gradually, and then finally with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, they really, really start growing. And China, another deeply, deeply impoverished country, another, country that was the sick man of Asia, full of mass poverty, malnutrition, hunger, illiteracy. All of a sudden it's turned into a gigantic superpower. And that's what it's about, because when Russia and China were deeply, deeply poor, and when their economies were dominated by British bankers and Wall Street bankers, and the people lived in just extreme poverty, they weren't competitors. But now that these countries have become, just these huge, huge, superpowers in the global market, now that they're doing that, they're competitors on the international market. At this point, Russia is producing huge amounts of oil and huge amounts of natural gas. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, their economy was just in a complete utter wreck. And then Vladimir Putin came in, and he had written, academic papers about the concept of what he called national champions. These are corporations or super corporations built up by governments and controlled by governments for the purpose of raising up the entire economy. He drew from Adam Smith, He drew from different economic theories, and he talked about creating Rosneft and Gazprom, which already existed, but transforming them and utilizing them as national champions. And essentially, Putin has turned Russia into an economic superpower once again. I mean, they were during the time of the Soviet Union, and he restored them to their level of being an economic superpower by controlling the oil and natural gas markets, using the state to plan out the economy. China, at the time of the revolution, 1949, they did not have a single steel mill. There was not a single steel mill in China in 1949. Well, today, China produces half the steel in the entire world. At this point, China has the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, Huawei, the cell phone manufacturer that's making those phones. China is cornering the market. It's 26% of the global car market at this point. They are pushing electric cars like crazy. You see the fact that now people can buy their oil and their natural gas, people can buy their steel, people can buy their cell phones from somebody else. And that both Russia and China, by lifting themselves out of poverty, by coming together, seizing control of their economic resources and rising up from nothing and transforming what were previously poor countries into global superpowers. By doing that, they have cut into the market. They've cut into the profits of Wall Street mega corporations, right? Every ounce of oil and natural gas that the Russians sell is an ounce of oil and natural gas that they did not buy from ExxonMobil. They didn't buy from BP or Shell. Every ounce of steel the Chinese export around the world is an ounce of steel that somebody did not buy from an American corporation or a Japanese corporation or a German corporation. That's what's happened. That imperialism, people think imperialism is about imposing culture. It's, imperialism is the fact that these countries have McDonald's in them, or the fact that people, around the world practice Christianity, not their indigenous faith. That's not the essence of what imperialism is. If you read Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, imperialism is the dominance of the market by mega corporations and monopolies, financial powers in Western countries that carve out spheres of influence and keep countries as captive markets to sell their products to, whereas these countries are kept from ever developing, ever selling their own products. All that happens is their resources get stripped away, and the Western monopolies control the country and keep it in a state of chronic poverty and underdevelopment. That's what imperialism is. It's an economic relationship in which countries are kept chronically poor so that Wall Street bankers can stay rich. And Russia and China have both broken out of that system, and they've broken out of that system by having state control over their economies. And, the same reason that the U.S. government hates Russia and China, they hate other countries, who've done this on a smaller scale. You can take, for example, Venezuela, right? Venezuela has essentially done what Russia did in the 1990s. Their oil was nominally nationalized, but it was basically controlled by Wall Street bankers. But when Hugo Chavez came into office, he changed the laws around how the oil company worked, so the proceeds of the oil resources and were going into the government budget, and he basically transformed Venezuela into a state-run economy centered around oil. And he then used that, to fund all kinds of social programs and to essentially, create a state that was independent of Western capitalism. They eventually set up an independent bank, the Alba Bank of Latin America, that was providing loans to different countries. Then they built huge amounts of housing. I've been there. I've seen it, right? So Venezuela also has taken control of its resources, restructured its economy in order to develop and raise people up out of poverty. Now, they've had some problems in recent years, but, Ecuador, take Ecuador, another country that did roughly the same thing. You can look at Bolivia. All these countries around the world, and they don't all have the same ideology, mind you. People will say they're all communists. No, the Russian government, absolutely, they do not consider themselves to be communists at all. They practice Orthodox Christianity. They're quite socially conservative, but at the end of the day, they control the oil and the banking sector. It's all under the control of the state. The state sets policy in the economy. Iran, there's another country that, of course, Western leaders just can't stand, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Well, what did Iran do? 1979, they took control of their oil resources, again, nominally nationalized, but then they seized control of them and started utilizing them to build up the economy. And I'll tell you, the Iranian government has done huge things for the economy. You look at some of these highways they have in Iran. You look at some of these power plants that they have in Iran. You look at the measures they've taken to provide electricity and housing to people in these rural areas, running water. The Human Development Index of Iran, they've done some really, really amazing things, and that's been through controlling their resources, through having control over their economy, through nationalizing their oil, centering the economy around the state, and planning to raise people up from poverty. Any country around the world, if they take control of their economic resources, they start planning their economy and start lifting themselves out of poverty, and they don't become just a captive market. They stop being a sphere of influence and start having a gravity of their own. If that happens, they're going to be targeted. And it doesn't matter what they call themselves. The Wall Street bankers are not sitting there thinking about ideology. They're not like, oh, this guy, he thinks about, this ideology. I do not agree with that. The Iranians, they call themselves Islamic revolutionaries. It's Shia Islam. But it has resulted in them taking control of their own economy and developing independently. Venezuela, they talk about Bolivarianism, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua. It's Bolivarianism. The Russian leaders are nationalists and Orthodox Christians. The Chinese are communists. They follow the teachings of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory. They just added the new president Xi. They added his thoughts for a moderately prosperous socialist society to their constitution. But these are just words. This is ideology. But what the Western leaders are threatened by is a threat to their profits. If these leaders were extolling these ideologies, but their countries remain deeply impoverished in captive markets, they wouldn't be attacked by the West. But when countries take control, and when they start building up from poverty and developing, that's when they become a threat to the global financial elite. Now, why am I talking about this, right? I'm here in New York City in the United States. Who cares about this? Well, it matters to me because I'm an American, and I'm from Ohio. And if you look at what these Wall Street billionaire elites have done to different parts of the world, if you look at, what they did to Latin America, if you look at what they did to Africa, you can read, there's a very good book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, about how they've destroyed any notion of economic development in Africa. If you look at all of that, you'll see that the same thing that they did to the developing world, or the global south, or the third world, or whatever you want to call it, the same thing they are now doing to parts of the United States. Deindustrialization, crushing small businesses, crushing development, and driving into poverty. There's been this controlled demolition of the American middle class by this, financialist elite based in, Wall Street, New York, based in London, and they have essentially demolished the domestic economy of the United States and absorbed it into this global financial system. And if you look at this, this is what it's about. It's about beating people down deeper and deeper into poverty so that you can maintain a monopoly for Western corporations, for certain corporations. And for a while, we Americans, we had some skin in the game. Hey, if they beat down all these other countries, we were here in the USA, so we got a good lifestyle. That's ancient history. With the computer revolution, you don't need industrial workers anymore. There's no place at the assembly line for us Americans anymore. We don't have a place in this global setup. What they've done to the rest of the world, they're now doing to the United States. For a while it was, Western nations colonizing third world nations. We're at the point where these billionaire financial elites don't have any domestic loyalties. I mean, you look at the Carnegies, the Morgans, these financial elites, they're not patriotic to the United States. They're not loyal. If you read, the Council on Foreign Relations, they talk about the open international system. They talk about, this kind of international capitalist system that doesn't really have any borders, doesn't really have any, domestic regulations or nationalism. It's all just kind of one globalist system where we're all seeing ourselves ground deeper into poverty, and a small banker elite just continues to make lots and lots of money. That's the new global setup. And what are they most afraid of? Populism. That's what they're most afraid of. You read it, what is the enemy that this, the folks, like Anne-Marie Slaughter and the Council on Foreign Relations, what is it that they are so afraid of? What is it that they're just terrified of? Populism. And what is populism? Populism is when a government steps in and takes action on behalf of ordinary people against this elite. You look at all the great American populists, people like Huey Long, William Jennings Bryan, Eugene Debs. These are leaders who rallied the population against financial elite, against Wall Street, against the billionaire financialists, and they called for the state to intervene on behalf of ordinary people. That's populism. When the government takes action on behalf of the population against the globalist elite, against the financiers, against the wealthy, and on behalf of the population. That's what populism is. And there is nothing that this global financial elite is more afraid of than populism. And they call Putin a populist. And they call the Venezuelan government populists. And they call the Chinese government populists. Any leader around the world that they don't like, they call them a populist, because what they're carrying out is a program saying that we are going to control our economy and make it serve the people, not the interests of the profits. And that's the fight that's going on today. It's a fight between the open international system and the specter, the ongoing specter of populism, as people are completely unsatisfied with the emerging low-wage international police state that's emerging. People want a government that serves them, a government that serves basic interests, that starts providing, peace and starts working for peace in the world, starts providing jobs, starts creating economic opportunities. They want the state to do what the state historically has done, to do basic statecraft and make sure the people, the population has a good life. That's been abandoned in this open international system, but that's what people overwhelmingly want.